Welcome to the Professional Dog Trainers Australia podcast, Dog Training Matters. Dive into effective training and behaviour modification techniques, share expert insights, debate hot topics, and discuss how to build strong, positive relationships with our canine companions. Whether you're a seasoned trainer or just starting out, join us as we champion methods that respect both dogs and their human partners. Let's embark on this journey together to elevate the world of dog training, because dog training matters.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Professional Dog Trainers of Australia podcast, Dog Training Matters. This podcast is presented by myself, Trish Cavarra, along with Jacqui, Zakar and Boyd Hooper. From time to time, the podcast will be presented by other board members of the Professional Dog Trainers Australia. But for this particular podcast, which we are presenting about defining dominance, it will be presented by us three. So hopefully you are looking forward to hearing our dulcet tones as we discuss the hot topic of dominance within the dog training community. So g'day to Jacqui and g'day to Boyd.
Hi everyone.
Hi everyone. Episode
Excellent.
1.
So it is episode 1. It's been a long time in the making, unfortunately, for various reasons, but we've finally managed to get this up and running, which is fantastic. And I'm very excited. And I really think that this particular topic, defining dominance, is an interesting one. And we're going to mainly discuss, I suppose, the misunderstanding of the word dominance, where it's come from, and of course, looking at the various studies and all the different information that's out there, and hopefully be able to either debunk or confirm whatever you might be thinking. So anyway, without any further ado, let's get into the first topic, I suppose. We are going to be discussing the history of dominance. So where did it all start? Jacqui, you've just given a presentation on this. So
Yeah.
I think your mind is really full of information.
Yeah,
let's maybe you to start us in.
So I kind of went through a few training ideologies and used that as a bit of a platform to start talking about dominance, because it seems to be defined very differently depending on which side of the training spectrum you're in. So I dived extra deep into kind of the history and where it came from. And I think a big part, the interesting part about the history is, for some reason, the arguments around dominance always seem to come back to what does dominance look like in wolves? And sometimes it gets lost that, well, like, are we trying to prove what dominance is or isn't in wolves, or are we trying to talk about dog behavior? And sometimes it's almost like if something gets redefined in the wolf studies, then that must automatically mean that it's different in dogs, but it doesn't always go like that. So I think you get both ends of the debate, but on one side it's almost become dominance isn't a thing, or it's the catchphrase of dominance has been debunked, or even the researcher that coined the term is then spending the rest of his career trying to remove what he said, and none of those things, like, there's some truth in all of that, but none of those things are specifically true. So I think David Meach is probably the better known in terms of the wolf researchers. But the term kind of more came from Rudolf Schenkel's studies. And it wasn't so much dominance, but the arguments about what alpha is. And he did some research looking at captive wolf packs in, I think it was a zoo setting in Switzerland. And while observing those wolf packs, his results pretty much were that there's like a dominance hierarchy structure in wolves, and that there's a vying for or competing for the dominance position, and it can be done in slightly more aggressive ways. Interestingly enough, one thing I did read was that Schenkel apparently did consider the family structure of wolves, but didn't put a lot of weight into that and tended to go more for the alpha pack leader dominance thing. After that, David Meach came along and he released a book called The Wolf. And that book didn't coin the term, which a lot of people think did. He just really summarized what the wolf research had shown up to that point. And that was kind of the first book that he released. And that's where That's where the alpha term came from more so. Schenkel's work wasn't really that well cited. It was really David Meach's work that was cited more. But after he released that book, then he started studying wolves on Ellesmere Island, which I think it's in Alaska, is it? Right up in the Arctic Circle. You've got your wolf families up there. And he actually spent every summer, I think, for about 24 to 26 years on Ellesmere Island studying wild wolves. And while he was doing that, he realized that wolves were more family units, and it wasn't so much the dominance hierarchy of competition and vying for position of leader of the pack. But that doesn't mean that dominance isn't a thing, and it doesn't mean that alpha isn't a thing. It's more redefining what those terms mean, because alpha really just means leader or first. It was just a case of how that status was obtained. And in wolf packs, it's obtained by just being the parent or the breeding pair. You just automatically become alpha. You didn't have to fight for that position. And because there's not much competition of fighting is because usually when they have young, by the time they're 1 to 3 years old, they will often disperse and they will go away and they will find their own mate and become a breeding pair of another family. So you don't tend to get challenges for position. They go away and make their own packs. So that's kind of where it is with wolves. But to clarify, even Meach says that it's not so much that alpha isn't a thing, it's just that the term doesn't really provide any extra information. And because it's become synonymous with force and aggression, it doesn't really do wolves or dogs any favors. So it's not so much that dominance, alpha, all that kind of stuff has been debunked, as some people would claim. It's been kind of clarified and redefined, and more talking about what terminology is useful and what's not. If that's a short synopsis.
We know that yeah, that's excellent, Jacqui. We do know that, wild wolves live differently to captive wolves. I was privy to spending a good 5 days in a captive wolf pack, if I can use that term, many, many years ago when the late Professor Ray Coppinger was alive. I actually did his canine cognition study tour back then. We had to go, it was called Wolf Park down in Indianapolis. And we got to spend pretty much, about an hour a day with this captive wolf pack. And I can tell you, the first day we went into the enclosure, there was a lot of what I like to term and what Ray Coppinger likes to term as ritualised dominance displays. So what we saw the wolves doing was lots of pinning down the other wolf, trying to, there was resource guarding. So they're the keepers there that the wolves knew fairly well were like resources. And so, if a lower ranking wolf came close, then, one of the wolves would move it on. And so there was a lot of that behavior going on. And that went on for at least the first time that we went in there. That went on for a good half an hour, if not longer. Granted, when it was the second day that we went in there, the wolves sort of got to know us and they were much calmer. So the arousal levels were a little bit lower, but there was still a lot of, pinning the other wolf down, growling, lots of, submissive posturing and dominance posturing. There was a whole heap of that going on. And I think for me, seeing that, and that was many, many years ago, for me seeing that and then hearing some people saying, number one, that, dominance has been debunked. Number two, wolves don't pin each other down. I just thought to myself, where are they getting this information from? And have they even spent any time with wolves or even looking at wolves, watching wolves and seeing what they do? So obviously, granted, this was a captive wolf pack. And funnily enough, I was following the story via website. Back then they used to have Wolfcam, and you were able to log into their website and follow the wolf pack, and you'd get newsletters and updates. And the leader wolf that they called at the time, his name was Tristan, and he had 2 sons within that same pack. And his 2 youngest sons, Wolfgang and Wotan, later, after I left, this was probably a couple of years after I left, were actually trying to kill him. So they were trying to kill Tristan. He was becoming an old wolf, and so they feared for Tristan's life. They removed him from the pack along with another older female, and Tristan sort of, lived and retired by himself along with another female. And one of the brothers, I forget which one, it might have even been Wotan, took over as the leader. So that was a very interesting story to hear of a captive wolf. And as we know, and as you've just mentioned there, Jacqui, the wild wolves live very, very differently. As in, they're not claimed, they don't fight for the top position, and a lot of the younger wolves break away, like they move on, and they find find a female.
Did
Exactly.
they talk about that? Did they cover that, Trish, when you were there, that in the wild, though,
yes.
they would probably break away and disperse?
Exactly. And the beauty of it was there was lots of comparisons. It was, Professor A. Coppinger was an ethologist. And so there was a lot of, cost benefit and what does it cost to fuel the big body of the wolf and all that sort of information. But, it was, and fighting all day is not productive. It's counterproductive to the survival of the pack. So the last thing they want to be doing is constantly fighting. But they did speak about the differences between the captive wolves and what is observed in
much bigger in
a wild
person
wolf.
than you expected them to be?
They are huge. Like I'm talking, if you look at, people think the Great Dane, and they had in the room that we were in, there were two skulls in a box. And one was a skull of a Great Dane and one was a skull of a wolf. And the skull of the wolf was twice the size of the skull of the Great Dane. So they are a big animal. And obviously, for them to obviously fight all the time, that's going to cost energy. That's energy costing exercise in the wild. So, but it was a very interesting course. I've actually still got all my notes. I've still got the videos. I've got everything. I've kept everything. If anyone's interested in watching the video, I think some of my NDTF students may have seen it. But if you haven't seen it, I might try and find a way to pop it in maybe on the members page and people can have a look at that. Maybe I can do that if there's an interest in it. So that's my thoughts there. But that's the difference. I agree with you, Jacqui. And I think people that discount completely dominance, and I think we were having a little bit of a discussion before we started recording, the different professions and their terminology of or their meaning of dominance. Ethologists have a different definitions as do other scientists, and of course dog trainers. And I think where the problem lies in that, as you mentioned, it's synonymous to punishment and to, harsh techniques. And this is where it falls down. And this is where the word has become so tainted that it's almost, if you use it, you're sort of risking your life, really.
What's kind of interesting, to mention how it's defined in different sciences, because I know in psychology it is kind of defined a little bit differently, but it's defined in a way where it would almost suit the more dominant side of training, because psychology has actually tried to define it in terms of a personality trait. So we know now that dominance is more a fluid behavior. It's not necessarily like a dog is a dominant dog. They are using dominant behavior. You know what I mean? But in psychology, they look at
Roger
it.
Brandt speaks.
Yeah, but in psychology, they look
Roger
at it.
Brandt speaks.
Yeah, exactly. He talks about it as a social behavior. But in psych, they look at it as, they've tried to measure it as an actual personality trait. So, you have the big five, like extroversion, agreeableness, all those big five personality traits. And they've tried to fit it under there so that you could be born and tend to have more of a fixed personality, because personality tends to be stable over your life. And I don't think it's had a lot of research put into it, and it hasn't yielded a lot of results, but they have looked into it and do try to define it as somebody might be higher or lower in dominance, and that would be stable over time. So when you look at kind of more dominance trainer ideology, that would almost suit them better, because they often say, well, that's a dominant dog and that dog wants to be more dominant because they are dominant. But so it's important, I think, for people to know that just because ethology defines it this way, it doesn't mean that other sciences define it exactly the same way. And it's like not an absolute thing. There are very definitions, but we want to get to the one that's the most functional and the one that's kind of most robust.
I think that when we're
The
talking
sad thing about
genetic predisposition or that temperament disposition, I think that it's fair to say with any trait, you were describing the ocean, the big five ocean, they're usually used in human research for the personality traits. And in dogs, it's a bit different, but that's a podcast for another day. But I think if we think about the genetic component of all of these, what are often referred to as TCPB, temperament, cognitive, psychological, and behavioural traits, that is to separate them from morphological and physical traits like coat colour and ear set and that kind of thing. So what we could, you could nickname those things behavioural traits, but that's a little bit of an understatement. But anyway, with these TCPB traits, it's more accurate to talk about predisposition and preparedness and propensity to behave in those certain ways. So I think it's reasonable to assume that different dogs will inherit largely different propensities and predispositions towards exhibiting dominance behavior or aggression or timidity or sociability with humans and numerous other things. And then the environment interacts with that to produce the outcome. So I don't think any reasonable person in the modern era who has any clue about biology and psychology thinks that there is no predisposition. They think it's the old blank slate model has been sort of completely debunked, but nobody also thinks the opposite, that the dog is born to be a dominant dog and there's not much you're going to be able to do about it. It's just some have much stronger predispositions.
That comes down to more like a dog that is more predisposed to be confident and assertive and forward versus a more sensitive dog. Like the more confident, assertive dog might be more likely to use dominance displays to get access to resources. Would you put it down like that?
All of the above. All of the above. Every one of those traits, different dogs have different predispositions and propensities to be like that, tendencies to be like that, preparedness to be like that. Okay. So, there might be one dog, for example, that given the right opportunity, maybe an older dog gets injured and incapacitated, and the one with the more predisposition and propensity might step up and try and take control in that circumstance, whether that be a wolf or a dog in a family or whatever, whereas another dog with much less predisposition is less likely to do that. But all of those dynamics, every one of those dynamics, different dogs have different preparedness, and it is largely genetic, and then those things interact with the environment. So you could have a dog that is highly prepared to be a very dominant dog, but just happens to grow up in an environment where he's kept in check by other dominant dogs, for example, or dominant owners, and the dominant disposition of the dog never really comes out. Another point I just want to say, to agree with a point both of you made earlier, I think that although having said everything that I've just said, I don't think that many of us really talk that much about the dominant dog anymore. It's not that we're dismissive of there's not such a thing with a dog that has a fairly high predisposition to exhibit dominance type behaviors. That's probably reasonable. But definitely we should be focusing on the dominance behavior model, which is just the dog exhibiting behaviors that we could categorize as dominance, but in the same token, we could use other terms. We could talk about them as being territorial or resource guarding, or control, a dog that likes to control certain environments. The dog is very controlling, or the dog is very jealous or over things, okay? And all of those are often, in some way or another, somewhat synonymous with the word dominance. And sometimes it's probably better to use a more targeted word, and other times in general conversation, I think it's reasonable, as long as we don't go too far either way. We don't want to dismiss them.
Exactly, and that's what it all comes down to. It's like these extreme black and white discussions, and the truth is usually somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's a complex interactive dynamic. I think there are lots of things in play.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the social structure of dogs, more so the free roaming dogs. So we do know that there is a group of dogs or a pack of dogs in Europe, in Italy, in Rome, and they've been around for a long time, so many years. And obviously, new dogs have been born and older dogs have died off. And the way that pack has been described is like fairly loose pack of dogs. There is obviously some sort of hierarchy where you've got a dog that sort of controls, some resources. But unlike a wild wolf pack, you don't have a breeding pair. The females generally tend to breed with any dog. Sometimes they'll go away and breed with maybe another group and then come back. So it's a fairly loose group, but dogs come in and dogs come out. So that's a very interesting observation there with regards to these roaming dogs. This is the one particularly in Rome. I know my husband, he does environmental work, and there's a place called the Barry Mountains here in Victoria, and there's some wild dogs that roam in around the mountains there, and they're a threat to the little pygmy possums and all the little wildlife that live there, because they're killing a lot of that wildlife for food. So there is, obviously there is control. Parks Victoria put a control measures in, and it was really interesting looking at the footage of these wild dogs that exist right here in Victoria. They don't look like any particular breed of dog. It's almost like they've morphed, like their whole bodies have morphed into almost proto dog like. And sometimes you sort of look at it and think, well, is there dingo in there, or does that look like a husky? It could very well be. But it's interesting when we know about the evolution of the wolf and how it morphed into the proto dog, and then of course we took those dogs and bred them and turned them into the modern European dogs that we have today. Could it be? And I'm just thinking out loud. But could it be that if we allow wild dogs and a dog escapes, or we dump a dog somewhere and then that dog breeds with others, and could it be that there is almost a morphing, physically morphing back to proto dogs, where they're not just scavengers, but they're also hunting as well? It's very, very interesting watching these dogs, and they mate, and more than one male will mate with one female, so she's giving birth to many offspring from the different male dogs there. So yeah, let's talk about that, because I find that absolutely intriguing.
Something else you
when we
touched
look
on with that, Trish,
how
sorry to cut you off. What you touched on,
Oh, yeah.
which is also interesting, is one way to try and study dogs in terms of free roaming dogs is they're doing that so that they can kind of see how do dogs behave when they're not so affected by humans. Because if you want to control your variables and you want to see how dogs behave, that's the best way to do it. And like you said, like in Victoria or the mountains where the wild dogs are, like there's controls in place to cull them or whatever they're doing. And that's what's really made it difficult for a lot of research to be done, because dogs tend to be affected by humans in some way or another. So I think though the Rome studies are one situation where they're not overly affected by people, they're not really being detrimental to the local human populations, because I think they're on the outskirts of Rome. It's not like they're wandering around in the city.
No, they're not in the city. No.
Yeah, so that's why you can kind of see how do they behave when humans aren't affecting them that much. And I think there's been quite a few studies done in, I think it's Western Bengal, which is another area where they're not really affected by humans too much. And they show similar things, like there are some levels of a dominance hierarchy, and they talk about the hierarchy tends to be much steeper than you would see in wolves or captive wolves. And they talk about it's because dogs don't tend to show the more subtle things and will maybe go to aggression a little bit quicker when there's competition. But it tends to be the dog studies, the free roaming dog studies, of where humans interact with the dogs or affect the dogs or disperse the dogs more, you don't see pack-like behavior as much. So it does seem to suggest that when left to their own devices more and more and more, some loose packs and even some kind of kin relationship packs do tend to form. And there is evidence of dominance displays and territorial aggression with neighboring dog packs as well. So
yes.
I think for so long people have said, oh, dogs aren't pack animals, there's no alpha, there's no dominance. But as more and more research is done, it's kind of starting to show, well, there kind of is a little bit of that in dog behavior when it's unaffected by people.
Jacqui, there was never any research or hard science to suggest that dominance didn't exist.
I know. Yeah.
That was
I'm not more disputing the fact that it's almost become trendy in some types of training that, oh, dominance has been debunked to the point where they don't even want to accept that it's a word, or they'll tell you it's a lot like a shh, don't say it out loud.
Mark Bekoff addresses this in a whole series of blogs on the Psychology Today podcast. Mark Bekoff's one of the most respected behavioral ecologists of all time, the chief editor of the Encyclopedia of Animal Behavior, amongst numerous other books. And he just thinks that, as do I, that it's just a joke that people would pretend and just make up. They're just giving an opinion. There's no evidence or science to support that. I also think a point that you just made is important. I've done some research on what I call village dogs in Indonesia in the times that I've been over there, and they are, whether you want to call this a dominant sort of behavior, but they definitely have the sort of like territorial behavior, like gangs of them, little packs of them, if you like, inhabit one sort of area along a particular area. It's not usually very far, a few hundred meters, maybe half a kilometre or something like that, where that's their hangout and they have their friends and they often get food from the locals and scavenge. And if any other dogs try and come into their territory, they'll chase them away. You occasionally see them showing resource over food, even within their group. So the group will protect their territory from other groups, other packs, if you will. I'm using the term pack very loosely here because this is not a tight pack. It's more like what you guys both expressed in those other examples, the ones in Rome. It's a very loose pack where dogs come in and out, but they're still territorial over that zone. And so that's the point, whether you want to call that dominance or whether you want to use a more maybe concise term, territorial or resource guarding or whatever. I think the main thing, and I think this is where we need to move in this talk, guys, is to talk about the fact that we're all in agreement that dominance exists. It exists in wolf packs. It can exist in domestic packs. It can even exist in the home environment. It's often an overused term. It's not very well defined in a lot of cases. Some people are using dominance as an all-encompassing term for any time the dog is stubborn, any time the dog shows resource guarding, any time the dog shows a controlling behaviour.
And I just interject there. But you're 100% right, because I've hung around with some force-free trainers in the past, and where they get this from is they hear other trainers say, well, the dog was pulling on the lead and the dog trainer said that the dog was dominant. The dog wasn't coming when called, and so the dog trainer that the person saw beforehand said the dog was being dominant. So this is coming from, and I suppose their understanding of dominance is coming from some trainers labeling, lack of training or, lack of whatever, lack of any discipline in dogs as the dog being dominant. And I think that's where the issue started, because then, like Jacqui said, as soon as, there was the debunking of the alpha, they took that and they ran with it. And that's where it's coming from. It's because some trainers in the past and even today, I hear of, and we may be going off on a tangent, but just quickly, I hear of there are still vets today that still tell owners to pin their puppies down, to put their puppies on the back, to dominate them. This is still being taught today. And this is the issue. This is where it's coming from.
Yep, I agree, 100%. 100%. And I think I mentioned the last time we chatted about this, Roberta Barada, who has a great book, which I think I sent through to you guys some of his stuff. And he did a little bit of like exploratory research by searching for alpha dominance terms online and seeing what trainers were saying about it in their blogs or on their websites. And he said that I think it was like 75 out of 91 mentions of it online by dog trainers were from force-free dog trainers. And he said, and Roger Abrantes was talking with him in a Zoom about it, and he said, it's almost like the force-free side have inadvertently talked about it so much that they've actually built it to be far beyond what it even is, and are almost promoting the thing that they're trying to disregard.
But I think that's happened in both directions. If we take other trainers who try and explain away, huge percentages of behavior as being a problem with leadership or a problem with, dominance and hierarchy, you need to take control, you need to dog. So let's just be clear. And I think we're all in agreement. And I know I can speak for the entire board and the vast majority of the members of the PDTA, is that we disagree with the extreme version of both. We do not agree that dominance doesn't exist. There's no such thing as dominance or whatever. And we also all agree that there are a percentage of people who attribute way too many things to a leadership problem instead of, as Trish said, a lack of education and or other types of things. And you know, it's quite easy to label 3/4 of every problem you can have with a dog and put a label of dominance on it if you really want to do that. And it's also more difficult, but possible, to explain away any problems with dominance behavior, including control issues, territorial issues, resource guarding issues, etc., and pretend that they are never an example of dominance in a social carnivore like a dog that comes from wolves that have hierarchies and dominance. I mean, and so, you know, it seems to me that either extreme is as silly as the others, and a more balanced perspective. And it depends on who you talk to. Sometimes you're dealing with people who are at one end of the spectrum and others at the other end. But I do think that, and a point you guys were alluding to, but I just think this is probably one we should spend a couple of minutes on and get you both to comment, is that I think that the force-free positive only community, even though they would probably agree with what most of us are saying, yes, of course, dominance does. I'm not saying all of them, but I think most of them would acknowledge that dominance exists in one form or another. Okay. But what they're worried about is that it opens the door for using protocols and procedures, let's call them balanced protocols and procedures, instead of force-free, because it's very difficult to explain how you're going to address dominance issues of any description, dominance behaviors or dominance-like behaviors, and a lot of these other things that we're talking about, using only a reward strategy. Okay. So because they only want to use a reward strategy, they're kind of forced into a corner whereby they can't necessarily acknowledge that there's dominance. Otherwise, the force-free strategy doesn't really make sense and is very open to criticism. What are your thoughts?
Can I chuck in?
I think that's right.
It's interesting you say that, Boyd, because I think it's kind of an example of that. I've been looking through a lot of research recently, and specifically was looking at some research into more positive reinforcement methods for treating behavioural issues. And in the study I was looking at, the force-free methods weren't shown to be that effective. And in the paper, they talked about in the past, when you had multi-dog household aggression issues, one of the protocols that would be used, and it said and would be effectively used, was nothing in life is free protocol. And technically speaking, if you look at kind of what dominance really is, you could argue that that is kind of like a dominance protocol, because it's the owner controlling all of the resources and the dog understanding exactly how they access resources, and it's through the owner. So if you're looking at proper definitions of dominance, that's kind of what dominance is. It's like, you know what I mean? And but the thing about that is,
as a first approximation, I agree with that completely. And actually, for a long time, when I was instructing on NDTF courses around that subject and for other groups and organisations, that was the sort of the main argument. Okay, this resource control, and if you, the owner, the trainer, can control all the resources, you are going a long way to preventing and addressing and managing any potential dominance and those kind of things. I don't think that answers everything, nor are you implying that, Jacqui. No. I don't think that's the whole story, but there's no question, I agree with you 100%, that is a major part of the story.
And we know that that can be part of the issue, like is competition over resources. And just to mention another little thing about researchers have looked at kind of alternative theories to dominance. And one of the theories they've looked at across different species is something called resource holding potential, or RHP. And basically what that looks at is two animals from the same species kind of size each other up as to, if we compete over this resource, who's going to come out on top. And so that looks at kind of physicality and fighting ability. With dogs, though, they found, as we know, size isn't such a big factor, and very little dogs will go after another dog over a resource. So they realize that model doesn't really fit. So they've also looked at an alternative kind of theory, which is, they call it the factor V or variable V, which is value. And it's about value of resource. And it's not necessarily that they want all the resources. It's just some dogs will see more value in some resources than others. So it's more about understanding which dogs see value in resources, making sure those resources are being fought over. And that kind of comes back to the nothing in life is free type of protocol as well. I think it's just like the whole dominance word, because nothing in life is free protocols have kind of been taken to be too harsh and too controlling. The baby's been thrown out with the bathwater. But it doesn't mean that you can't use variations of those kind of protocols in a kind way and the dogs are getting all their needs met, but we're still making sure there's no competition. It's just a shame that we see these types of protocols thrown out before we see other effective positive reinforcement protocols which are as effective. And I think that's part of the problem, is things get thrown out too quickly.
Boyd, that resource holding potential, Boyd, that was I forget the lady's name, the author. She wrote the book Accelerated Learning. You've met
Pam Reed.
Sorry,
Pam Reed.
Pam Reed, yes, she was the one that coined that. I think she did a video back in 2002 or something called Aggression in Dogs, where that's where that came from. And that was, very, very interesting. And she would say, putting two dogs together or a group of dogs together and pretty much seeing who's got the potential to hold the resource at the end of the day. But I agree with you 100%. We've thrown, NILF is a very, important part of, I suppose, especially if you do have a multiple dog household. That's one of my specialties. That's what I do, multiple dog household issues. And it is very much about controlling. But as we know, dominance over resources is fluid. Like you said, one dog may see a resource more importantly over than what another dog will. And that's when issues can start.
That's as you described, that's really the true definition of dominance. It's a fluid social between two dogs interaction.
Exactly. And everything to do with the multiple dog household issues and maybe this could be a topic for another podcast, is relationship based. So there's lots to do with the relationship amongst the individuals in the household. But if we can just move on, just sticking to what we've got here, I just want to talk about, I suppose I like to call it ritualised dominance displays. I just carry on from what Professor Ray Cobban just says. Just what we see, I suppose, the dominance displays that we see in wolves and the similarities to what we may see in our dogs today, our modern European dogs today. Do they mean the same thing? So if we do know that, T-boning, for example, we might see that more often in a wolf, in a group of wolves where, the T-boning, when one wolf puts his neck or head over the neck of the other dog, or the pinning down. We see that happening in our dogs today. Do you reckon it means the same thing though? Like, is it a lot of relationship forming? Like, this is the way they form relationship, two dogs coming together, whether they're known or unknown. This is their ritual, their ritualized behaviors.
I'd like to just say one thing, that certainly some of those behaviors can just simply be play behaviors. Like several of my dogs that run together and never have any aggressive issues. And I'm talking about big, strong, powerful, working type dogs. They can run together unattended for hours at a time, have kongs and balls around each other, have food together and everything without any challenges, any resource guarding, any territorial or anything like that. But they still do exhibit some of those display sort of things every now and again. They just don't really have any bad intentions and they don't follow it through. And I also think you talk about Roger Abrantes, and certainly many others have argued that the ritualised displays are designed to limit the actual, follow through, the actual aggressive responses and the escalation of things. It doesn't always work that way, of course. Quite often when one dog exhibits a display, it actually triggers the other dog and it's on for young and old, without a doubt. But in principle, the evolutionary history of those things was to try and prevent the escalation of those things. And it certainly can work. So I think that there is definitely still some alignment. It's not a one-on-one or one-for-one alignment between wolves and the modern dogs, but certainly the ritualized displays still have, in some circumstances, still have quite similar or identical meanings to what they did historically and still serve those functions. But I do think that there's much more examples of it where it's more a play sort of a thing, or the dog doesn't really have a lot of intentions and it's kind of like autopilot without much meaning behind it.
Yeah. We see it lots when, if you're sort of watching dogs at dog parks and things like that. I don't tend to go to dog parks a lot, but if I'm sort of walking past and there's some dogs roaming around, I tend to watch the interaction between the dogs, and I do see a lot of those ritualized displays. And yeah, it doesn't mean that one dog is trying to be domineering over the other, but that is obviously the way, their behaviors, and that's the way they just express themselves in their interaction. The pinning down, the T-boning, and sitting on the humping, all those other things. And people say, well, humping is just arousal, but humping is also a sign of dominance as well. So is the dog humping because it's aroused, or
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so it's interesting. But again, and this is where those people that say that that there's no such thing as dominance or dominance behavior, what do they, when they're watching and observing a group of dogs in a dog park, what are they seeing? What are they interpreting as these behaviours as being?
Trish,
I'd like to know anyway.
I'm not so sure they are observing. That's the point, right? And if they are observing, they're not really interpreting, And I think, again, this is the kind of thing, I know Ray well as well, and went over to do stuff with him in 2013 and the like as well. Guys like him and Mark Beckoff, these behavioural ecologists and ethologists and stuff like that with decades and decades of experience, they talk about these ritualized displays, and by definition what they're saying, if it's a ritualized display, that means it's kind of automatic, it's a built-in thing, which means that it's an evolved thing, which means that it had to have some sort of evolutionary function, some sort of purpose, which, as we said, one thing was to sort of establish hierarchies and show where you stood. Okay, so if you're being submissive, you're accepting that the other one is higher in you in the hierarchy, for example, or that you don't want to fight. But if you're stacking up and you're standing over and that kind of thing, then you're not being submissive and you're sending signals. That's a ritualized display intended to submit information to the other party. And some of that is to do with hierarchical elements, okay, as long as we're not getting out of control. It's not all about dominance and all of that. I also do think that a lot of it is so ritualized, as I said, that I don't think there's a lot of conscious thought in the process. A dog can sort of show, quite often I see dogs showing displays, and they really don't have any intention of pushing it any further or anything like that. It's just they get into the habit of behaving like that, or they're really not giving it much thought, so to speak, using a little bit of an anthropomorphic term there. But yeah, I think that ritualized displays are a normal part of behavior. You've got to be careful of them. You can use them as a form of information. You can use them as a bit of a predictor to determine, is this going to escalate or anything like that? Yeah, but without getting carried away.
Exactly. And as Roger Brantis says, it's the ritualized dominance displays are there to keep the peace. And when fighting starts, it's now turned into aggression. So that, they can be precursors, unfortunately, for some dogs. So we can use them as a good guide. But I tend to agree with you. And I would like to know, those that think that there is no such thing as dominance, what are you, when you're watching dogs in a park and you're watching the ritualized displays, what are you interpreting that as? Anyway, that's just my question. Can we move on? Boyd, you made a point here about different models of training. So you've got the, whether you're training under the Skinnerian model or whether you're training under the pet parent model, whether you're training under the dominance leadership model. Did you want to elaborate on that point? Because I think that's very important, because obviously that different ones are going to have different techniques. Or is that something that you want to discuss in a different podcast?
It is something I want to discuss on a different podcast, but I'll give a snapshot overview, because I think it's probably, we're getting towards the end of this one now anyway, and so this is probably good.
Sure.
Okay, so I've been teaching for years that sort of very broadly, loosely speaking, first approximation stuff, there are 4 broad models. Okay, so the first one I'll talk about, it's more of an American model, often called the pet parent model. Okay, so you're treating your dog like a child and you're raising them there. The second one is the Skinnerian model, same way that Skinner trained his pigeons and rats and things like that. So there's no social dynamics, there's no consideration of the dog's feelings or emotional states or affective states or anything like that. It's just all about mechanistic. So the owner or the trainer is a treat dispensing machine, and the animal similarly exhibits behavior in order to earn reinforcers and stuff like that. And some clicker trainers are sort of like that. Okay, they try and take the social dynamics completely out of the equation. I think most people since about by the time we got to the 1960s and 1970s, that was starting to lose credibility. But certainly in the 21st century, that is only the hardcore radical behaviorists really follow that doctrine anymore. But it creeps back in again, and some of the things that were said earlier in this podcast were still remnants, if you like, of the way that people do think about just earning resources, controlling resources. That Skinner's argument was exactly that. You read some of Skinner's early work, and he says if you can control the resources of the child or the animal, and the animal realizes that it has to exhibits that it has to exhibit good behavior in order to get access to its valued resources, you will have control over that individual. And I'm paraphrasing Skinner there. And while that's true to a certain degree, and he was able to achieve that with his pigeons and rats, it doesn't really take into account social dynamics, which we clearly have with dogs and with our children and the like. And for that reason, many have been critical of that, most notably Alfie Kohn in his book Punished by Rewards from 1999 goes into detail of what a terrible idea that is. So that's not to say that reward training isn't valuable and that Skinner didn't teach us a lot of good lessons. It's just that that shouldn't be the overarching dynamic of how you interact with the dog and how you control its behavior. You are not a treat dispensing machine and the dog is not a pigeon, okay? You have a close social dynamic, and we need a system that is much more socially orientated in order to be effective. So that leads us to the third one, which is the one we've been talking about. Let's call it the dominance hierarchy model. And that is much more about a social dynamic, but not necessarily a very good one, particularly, and this is a key point which I think you guys will absolutely agree, is that particularly not as the primary social dynamic, because we know from what Jacqui said and from all of the research from Dave Misch and, Catherine Lord and numerous other people who've been studying, Adam McCloskey and his team over there, Frederic Varani and all that crew in Hungary and through Europe and stuff, the Hungarian researchers at their wolf centres over in Europe, they've all come to the conclusion that dominance hierarchy is not the primary dynamic in the wolf pack. It exists. It's part of the social dynamics, where nobody's dismissing that there is a dominance hierarchy to one degree or another. There is such a thing as a sort of an alpha and some sort of hierarchy, but it's not the main thing. It's not the primary dynamic. It's much more of a secondary thing. It's there. It's used when it needs to be, but it's not really on a day-to-day basis. It's not really there. Okay. Just like the captain of a team or something like that. Every now and again, the captain has to maybe step up and pull somebody into line because they've stepped over the mark. But for the most part, they're not doing that. So you wouldn't say the primary dynamic in the captain of a team is to instill, to act like a really strong, dominant leader and enforce every rule and everything like that. They could if they needed to, but it's not the primary. And it's also quite counterproductive to building cooperation and collaboration. So that's well established. And the Kim Stallernley, who's an Australian researcher up in Canberra, he's sort of the leading researcher in the world on that. He had a really nice talk on the Dissenter podcast with Ricardo Lopez. You can listen to that if you like. And I don't remember the number, but, talked about exactly these things, how the more you try and establish a dominance hierarchy as your primary model, as your primary social dynamic for managing the group of any description, human group, dog pack, whatever, human-dog relationships, the more you try and emphasize dominance hierarchy, the more that's going to adversely impact on cooperation and collaboration. And Dave Misch says that as well. Mark Beckhoff says that as well. Ray Coppinger, all of those people sort of make those kind of arguments. So that leads us to the fourth one, is a more team dynamic cooperation and collaboration. And I call it the dog-human cooperation collaboration schema, where we get this dynamic where you and the dog are working together. I think if we look at the picture here, the old PDTA logo, where we can see the dog and the human sort of really interacting, working together in a social dynamic, like a really well-oiled team. Might be just a team of two, like a partnership, okay, like we see in many sports or many other activities where two people can work together and collaborate on a task. And that's really what I want. I want my dog that's working with me. We've got a common goal. I give an example of, if I'm training my dog to search for a target, I say to the dog, I pull out the ball and I say to my dog, hey, I feel like playing ball. And the dog goes, I'd love to play ball. And I go, well, we can't play ball unless we find a target odor. And the dog says to me, I'm an expert at finding target odor. I've got a great nose and I can find a target. So I say to the dog, all right, how about you find the target? I'll meet you there and we can play ball. And the dog goes, awesome. That's great. Dog finds the odor. I deliver the ball. We play a game of retrieve or tug on a ball with a string or something like that. And everybody wins. No need for dominance. We're working together. We're collaborating for a common goal. He wants to find the odor. I want to find the odor. And everybody's having a great time. And when we do find the odor, our common goal has been met and we celebrate together. And it's all about cooperating and collaborating. Now, that's not to dismiss that reward training still has a lot of role. Okay, I'm still delivering rewards. So there's still a bit of Skinner in there and Thorndike for sure. But it's not the primary dynamic. And there's still leadership. I still have to set and enforce constructive limits and boundaries. I still have to enforce social norms. The definition of a rule is something that is enforced. Okay, you can't call something a rule if you don't enforce it. Otherwise, it's just like a request. That's kind of the difference between a request and a rule, is one is enforced and one is not. So they're there, but they just shouldn't be the main thing. And if you can get your dog to cooperate and collaborate, you don't need to do much in the way of enforcement because you're working together. You're on the same team. Everybody's wins. So that's it. We can talk about it in more detail.
Absolutely. I think we're running out of time, guys, but I think from the sounds of it, there will be a part 2 at some point where we can elaborate more on the different models of training based on what Boyd just mentioned, because I think they're really, really good points. I think,
and particularly,
Boyd,
Trish,
you've made...
Trish, once we get feedback from the listeners, you know, so send in your comments, guys, and give us feedback. So as when we do a part 2 or maybe a part 3, we can address the...
Great segue, Boyd. I think that would be a really great topic of discussion.
Now, it is our first podcast, so we are obviously, you know, just feeling our way around. So we would love the feedback from you guys, but also Jacqui and Boyd and also myself. If anyone, you've mentioned some research and links to podcasts and things like that, perhaps we could put them up on the members page once the podcast has been launched and people can go and look up these particular researchers and listen to the podcasts themselves. So if you're happy to share those, we can certainly do that. And to the listeners as well, if there was something in particular that you wanted to know more about, or you had an interest in any of the research that any of us have mentioned, just mention it in the members page and we will try and provide the research link or the podcast or information link for you. So just with that, I think that's probably the end for today. And also just for the listeners, from time to time, obviously there will be other members of the board presenting podcasts. It won't be just us 3, so you will get to hear other voices, and we'll also be having guests, special guests on from time to time, you know, debating various topics and discussing various topics as well. So if there's something that interests you, please let us know. Please let us know in the members page and we will endeavour to get that done for you. But I think it's been a really good one. What do you reckon, guys?
We smashed it.
Pretty good.
We dominated it.
That is a taboo word, Jacqui.
Okay, we'll see you at the next one, guys. Thanks for listening.
Good job,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.